Vered Guttman is an Israeli chef, food writer, and food historian living in the Washington, D.C. area. Her columns and articles on Israeli and Jewish food have appeared in Haaretz and the Washington Post, among other places. Vered is a contributor to Moment Magazine's Talk of the Table column. Her writings also appear on her blog, Vered's Israeli Cooking. In 2014, she cooked for President Obama's Passover Seder at the White House. Since October 7th, Vered has volunteered with Israeli-American grassroots group Unacceptable DC, which holds weekly rallies to release the hostages. Vered is a representative of the Hostage and Missing Families Forum. Joining Vered today is Moment Deputy Editor Jennifer Bardi. Please welcome Vered Guttman and Jennifer Bardi.
Welcome to our Moment viewers. Welcome, Vered. Thank you so much for being here today. I know for myself and for a lot of people watching, we are very familiar with you as a chef and a food writer, and we really enjoy your Talk of the Table columns at Moment and elsewhere. And so wanted to thank you for those. And of course, today we're here to talk about a very different aspect of your life that's been kind of ever present over the last year, and that's your advocating for the release of the hostages in Gaza. And so, want to have a conversation with you just to, hear about how you got involved. I know that you've been organizing with the group Unacceptable DC, which started, I think, it's a larger group, started in the Bay Area as Israeli expats who were protesting the judicial overhaul in Israel, but which has pivoted. And so I want to get into hearing a lot about your activities there and with the Hostage and Missing Families Forum in Israel. But before we do, I wanted you just kind of, for viewers who kind of maybe know you as a chef or a food writer who don't really know you at all, if you could just talk a little bit about your life as before this past year, your work, your family, both in Israel and here in the United States.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's an honor to be here. My life before October 7th seems like 100 years ago. I'm an Israeli American. You can hear it in my accent, I'm sure. When I moved here from Israel with my family 23 years ago, my husband, Nathan Guttman, who probably some of our viewers know as well, he writes for Moment Magazine for a long time. We moved here for his job at Haaretz back then. He now works for Israeli television. And I was a software developer in Israel, but moved to the food business as many immigrants do. After moving here, so I write about food. I write about the history of Jewish food from around the world. And we have 3 sons, and we live in the DC area, and everything was peaceful and fine. I was not involved too much in politics, not more than any average Israeli. We're always into politics. I did not do much in politics.
Mm-hmm. And so with October 7th, you really kind of, from day one, as I understand, were involved. And I know that you've organized these for a good part of the last year, these vigils every Sunday. They were at the Red Cross headquarters in Washington, D.C. And I know, some have been on Zoom. And then, as I understand, you've had a couple demonstrations in front of the Israeli ambassador's residence. So walk us through how that all came to be, how you got involved with that.
Okay, so October 7th happened, and we actually happened because my husband is a journalist with Israeli media. We got notifications very early. It was late at night on Friday, but we ended up staying up all night and basically up all that month, watching in horror what was going on in Israel. And I think, like many Israelis and many American Jews, I felt I had to do something. I had no idea what. I have a friend that works for the New Israel Fund, and the first Friday, so 6 days after October 7th, we just, just printed some posters of hostages. The posters were not popular as they are today. There were no real posters available then. We kind of made something up, printed them, and went to the first pro-Israel rally that happened near the White House that first Friday, and just handed out these flyers with photos of the hostages. And from the first week, through my friend Tali, I joined this group, Unacceptable DC. As you mentioned, Unacceptable DC is the DC chapter of a grassroots organization called Unacceptable that has chapters all over the US. And it started as an organization that was protesting against the judicial coup that the Netanyahu government was trying to do in Israel. But with us, Unacceptable DC, from the first week, we completely changed course and only concentrating in advocacy for the release of the hostages. We held weekly rallies at the American Red Cross in DC in order to keep the issue of the hostages in the public eye. And we kept being non-political and insisted on that for most of the year last year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So who comes to these vigils? Who's sort of been a constant presence?
So that's a good question because most of our crowd, most of the organizers are Israeli Americans. We have some Jewish Americans, people from the Jewish community here that are helping, but more kind of behind the scene. But so the organization is done mainly by Israelis. But most of our crowd, the vast majority of our crowd, are Jews, are American Jews, not Israeli Jews. And I can't tell you how much this means to us. It's funny that we even need to talk about it, but for some reason, the Israeli Americans and the Jewish Americans that you would think would naturally be one community, they never were one community. And I think Israelis, even after living for years in the United States, practice their Judaism and having their communities in other ways. We're not used to going to synagogues. We're definitely not used to paying dues to a synagogue. So there was never really a connection. And then October 7th happened. And turns out, very naturally, we are the same community. I do not need to explain to any of my fellow Jews here the pain that I feel. They feel it just as well. And it was so important to us. And so we're so touched by it that the Jewish community was with us for the whole time.
So Vered, I mean, this sounds like a full-time job, organizing all of this and these speakers and vigils. And, I do want to ask you about this kind of shift into the more political, but I did also want to ask first, were you also at the same time having hostage families come, and were you kind of a liaison there as well?
So it did not start immediately. I have to say it almost at this point, it really is almost a full-time job for me. But the rallies, I was in charge mainly of recruiting the speakers. But it's definitely a group job, like Unacceptable DC. We have about 10 people who are organizing this, and it was a mutual effort for all of us, and all of us were investing so much time for this to happen. It's not easy to have a weekly rally, to have a speaker, and usually 2 or even 3, to have a musical performance, every week. It is a lot of work. But we felt that through the speakers, we're reaching a much wider audience than just the people that were standing there with us. So it was very important to us to keep that going.
It's really, really interesting what you said about the Israeli community, in the U.S. and your experience that really it wasn't a lot of interaction or connection with the Jewish American community, and that this really brought these two groups together in solidarity. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, but also did that sort of coincide with this shift in your advocacy becoming more political?
Even when we started to realize that the Israeli government has something to do with the fact that a hostage deal is not being signed, we still did not want to make the rally political, because we felt it was more important to keep the issue in the public eye and to have the biggest umbrella we can have. But in the last 3-4 months, when the IDF, the Shin Bet, and the Mossad were all saying that it's time for Israel to sign a deal, and they were encouraging Prime Minister Netanyahu and the government to sign a deal, and they were saying that there's no security issue in the ceasefire deal that the IDF cannot handle, and that releasing the hostages was important on so many levels for the Israeli society. And the government and Netanyahu were still not signing a deal. That's where we felt that we cannot continue to be non-political anymore. Most of our American Jewish crowd stayed with us. There were a couple that did not feel comfortable and maybe have left and did not show up for the rallies anymore, but most of them and the speakers that we got were still amazing. We still had a great attendance until the summer, where if you live in DC, most people leave and go on vacations, and the heat is unbearable. Not like in Gaza, but we decided to move the rallies to change it into Zoom events that we were still holding every Sunday morning. And this actually enabled us to have more hostage families speak with us from Israel. I forgot to mention earlier, but we had quite a few hostage families, released hostages that were speaking at our rallies as well. And it was always very special and brought a lot of emotions from our audience. We had Yair Golan, who is the head of the Democratic Party, speak at one of our Zoom events. We had Orit Soliziano, the head of the Association of Rape Crisis Centers in Israel. This organization was the one that issued the first report about sexual assault on October 7th. They're working now on a follow-up report about sexual assault in captivity, and still on October 7th, now that they gather even more evidence. So we had a great program during the summer. And then what happened was the murder of the 6 young hostages. So among them Hirsch, of course, who is an American citizen, together with Carmel, Ori, Almog, Alexander, and Eden. All young people that survived being hostages for so long, for 11 months and almost, and were murdered just as the Israeli army got closer to them. And I have to emphasize this, like some people phrase it as they were almost being rescued, but actually the army, the IDF, only managed to rescue 7 hostages throughout this year, and 27 hostages were murdered in captivity.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes when the IDF got closer to them and they were shot by Hamas because Hamas did not want the IDF to rescue them. Sometimes the hostages were killed because the IDF was bombing the area. So by mistake, by horrible mistake, they were killed. But the only way, I have to emphasize, the only way to rescue hostages is by a deal. That's how the majority of hostages were rescued. Mm-hmm. So Hersh, Carmel, Ori, Almog, Alexander, and Eden were not almost rescued because there was no deal on the table, but they did survive, hardly survived. We just had a report of how skinny and what starvation they were facing there when their bodies were retrieved and brought to Israel. People were astonished of how skinny they were. They were murdered just hours probably before the IDF found their bodies.
Mm-hmm. And talk a little bit about the difference in the reaction to that here, I mean, where you live and in the circles you're working in, and then what you observed in Israel.
So so that's exactly the point I was going to go for, because it was very different. And for the first time since the war started, and with the closeness that we have with the Jewish community, when on the night that this was announced, first there were rumors that they were murdered, and when it was confirmed, everyone was heartbroken. There's no doubt, heartbroken. But it was very difficult for me to see how quick the Jewish organizations came out with condolences and may their memory be a blessing and notifications, when I felt rage and frustration more than anything. And then, in Israel, that's when the shift happened. And on that weekend, there were 750,000 people outside in the streets protesting the Israeli government for not achieving a hostage deal until now. And in here, the Jewish organizations and synagogues in our area in DC did this beautiful vigil that, I was watching from home, but crying half the time of it. But where was the rage in there? Mm-hmm. It was very difficult for me and for my colleagues in Unacceptable DC and other Israelis to see that. We were so angry. Mm-hmm. And of course sad, and of course could understand and relate to the sadness of the Jewish community, but we wanted to see the rage that we felt. And that's when we moved our rallies that we held for almost 11 months then. We changed them from rallies to protests, and we moved it in front of the Israeli ambassador's residence in DC. We had about 120 people protesting with us. Again, all of them, like 90% of them are American Jews, not Israeli Americans, and protesting from their pain and frustration of the behavior and the neglect of the Israeli government of the hostages. I think we all feel that the mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuim, of releasing the captives, it is the most important mitzvah in Judaism, as Maimonides said 1,000 years ago or so. And it's funny because I never even thought about it until this year as a Jewish mitzvah. For me, it was an Israeli mitzvah. It's a core value of Israel. It always was. No one is left behind. Israel released more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, including Sinwar himself, to free Gilad Shalit, that was held for almost 6 years in Hamas hands. I have to, as a side note, just to say here that when Hamas captive Gilad Shalit, a soldier, an IDF soldier, they asked for 450 hostages. And after 6 years, Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, released more than 1,000 hostages. No, I'm sorry. Netanyahu released almost more than 1,000, like I think 1,025 or 1,045 prisoners, including Sinwar. So the deals are not getting better. They're getting worse. And in this case, the hostages are held in tunnels. We just saw how many of them and how easily they're being executed by Hamas. We don't have that time. So, but to your point, the rage that Israelis felt, the rage that many of the people that were standing with us for this year felt, and the truth is they did come and stand with us in front of the ambassador's house, although it did feel uncomfortable to many of them, they did come out, I felt the Jewish community at large, and definitely the Jewish community leaders, were not with us then. With a beautiful, beautiful, touching vigil that represent really the sorrow and sadness that they felt. For us, it lacked the rage.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I think it's an important point, and I mean, you're speaking about this from just this lived experience over the past year, and I think for many Jewish Americans, for many Americans, period. I mean, Hirsch Goldberg Poland was a name they knew. They knew his parents. People who watched the RNC or the Democratic National Convention saw them speak, and they saw that heartbreak and that anguish, and I think too we came to know him. We knew his face and his story partly because he was an American, but I think that I want to ask you about yourself and how this is all affecting you, but just to put a final point on that story, what factors brought him to everyone's attention, and how do you feel? Do you feel like you are just advocating for all of the hostages that are remaining? And we're talking about, I think, 101, a fair number of whom I hate to point out the grisly truth is that they're deceased. But I mean,
about half probably.
About half.
Netanyahu said it openly, so we can say.
So do you feel, or maybe both can be true, but do you feel like it is important to elevate these individuals' lives and their worth and their story, and at the same time not forgetting about anybody?
Of course. So that's what we were trying to do for the whole year. I mean, the point of making these rallies that we did was we were always trying to make to highlight personal stories, to bring any family of hostages and released hostages that agreed to speak to come there, so people will know them. I think that's why the advocacy work that Rachel and John Pauline Goldberg did was so incredible, not only for Hirsch, but for all the hostages, because they made their story personal. And it was so important. We heard that from anyone who is dealing with hostages release efforts. They always said, like, keep telling the story, keep making it personal. That's the most important thing. That's what we were trying to do for the whole time. Now, for me personally, through the work with the Unacceptable DC and the rallies, I got to meet some of the families and started to help them separately. I'm now a representative of the Hostage and Missing Families Forum in Israel. I work specifically with the diplomatic desk there. And some of the things that I was doing this year outside the rallies, just to tell you how full-time job this has become, I set up meetings there was one family, for example, that came from Israel, not through the forum of the families, and they arrived on Christmas Eve planning to have meetings in DC, which of course they couldn't, but they had no idea. So I contacted Jamie Raskin, he's my congressman, but he did not know me. He called me back in 15 minutes and came to dinner at my house to meet this family, and met them at his office later and spoke about them. He's been really a champion for us this year. Of course, so many lawmakers in Washington from both sides of the aisles war, but he's my congressman, and I can tell you there wasn't anything that I asked that he would not reply and accept, and had so many one-on-one meetings with released hostages and families of hostages, and did so much to help them. I had a meeting at my house with another released hostage who cannot speak publicly, unfortunately. The Shin Bet advised her about that because she still has family in captivity. So I had at my home an event with heads of Jewish organizations and her. I had an event, a private event with Orit Soliziano from the rape crisis centers. So I had a private event for her. With me, I initiated and helped to organize a security briefing with Major General Noam Tibon and former head of Mossad, Tamir Pardo, with heads of Jewish community organizations, just thinking, this was very lately, actually, 2 weeks ago or so. The idea was for them to understand really where the Mossad and IDF and Shin Bet have been standing for a while, and what that means, that when Netanyahu and the government are saying that Israel cannot sign the deal, maybe to hear directly from the experts on where the security entities in Israel stand on that. I helped to organize an interfaith vigil at the St. Mark's Presbyterian Church in North Bethesda. I'm trying to think what else. And where I stand now personally is where I feel that I almost expect the Jewish community leaders to step out of their comfort zone, and I really want them to call, to announce that they support the ceasefire deal. Of course, Hamas did not accept it as it is, and if there's any way to put pressure on Hamas, you want my help? Just tell me what to do, and I will do it. But we cannot ignore that we need to put some pressure and at least ask the Israeli government to do the same. Netanyahu's insistence on the Philadelphia corridor, for example, the IDF, Shin Bet, and Mossad all say is not necessary at all. It will actually put more soldiers at risk and will not solve the issue of the tunnels underneath it. So it just does not make sense. And I would love to see the heads of the Jewish community organization stand with the Jewish community itself, because a recent poll, a serious poll, we can send the details later if people are interested, said that 87% of American Jews support the ceasefire deal. 87%. That's a major majority. They prefer that over continuing the war. So I want the Jewish community leaders to stand with their community and with their Israeli American brothers and sisters. We are also part of this community, and make an ask from the Israeli government without criticizing them, just making sure they understand that the mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuim is a core value for the community here, and that signing the ceasefire deal, we know that it will save Israel from a war that the IDF can no longer handle. It's a small army and it's too long of a war. So it's essential for us.
Yeah. Well, and I can imagine that viewers are wondering as well, with this offensive into Lebanon to dismantle Hezbollah, or punish them, how commentators and reporters are saying it's really shifting the focus away from Gaza, which naturally means away from the hostages. And so is this changing your advocacy, or just is it just kind of
yeah. It's hard. I mean, it's not like we know what's the right thing to do. We're trying to do our best, and I think so many people are. And I know how much the Jewish community leaders that I was talking about now, they're doing so much for Israel and so much for the hostage families. I know that their hearts are in the right place and in the most consistent and powerful way. It's hard to really know what to do. I want to say that we actually, after protesting for 3 weeks in front of the ambassador's residence, we asked for a meeting with him and just had it earlier this week. And he agreed to actually speak to the Jewish community leaders and encourage them to write a letter or to issue a statement that will encourage the government to sign the ceasefire deal, as long as it is not a political statement, which of course it does not need to be. It comes from Jewish values. It does not need to be political. So we are so appreciative of his effort, and of course the embassy has been doing so much for the hostages throughout the year and for their families in any way they could, and we appreciate that. How do we continue? I'm not sure, but what you asked about shifting the focus from Gaza to Lebanon, it's true. It's so true, and it's so heartbreaking. I mean, I've been in the U.S. for so many years, and this is the first year that I've been actually watching the Israeli news every single day since October 7th, and the issue of the hostages moved on the news, the major news shows, from the first item to the fifth, the sixth, like from the first minute to minute 30. If you can just try to imagine the heartbreak of the hostage families, And maybe we should talk about that as well, because I do want to see the help of the Jewish community in this aspect that I'm going to talk about. We mentioned at the beginning that the hostage issue became political in the US, but also in Israel. And it became political, which is unimaginable before this year, that hostages will become political. Hostage families and even released hostages are being harassed by Israelis, by Jews who support the government, by right-wing extremists in Israel. This week there was a quiet protest of families of hostages in front of a gathering of the Likud party. The father of Liri Elbag, who is a soldier that was captured on October 7th, and she's still held, she's alive as far as we know, and she's still held there. He was speaking there and called the government in a very peaceful way to sign the deal, and supporters of Likud threw eggs on him. And I can tell you that it's hard to breathe when you think about that.
Yes.
So these families are suffering the unimaginable of not knowing what's going on with their loved ones and thinking of all the suffering that they have in the tunnels. And instead of getting the support, they're being thrown eggs on. Mm-hmm. And a couple of weeks ago, two activists for the release of the hostages put flyers of release the hostages with some photos of hostages in the synagogue of one of the Knesset members. And the three women that did that, actually, two of them are already retirees, one in her 40s. They were handcuffed and taken to police for questioning. They were held there for 8 hours into Shabbat to ask about why they put flyers calling for the release of the hostages in a synagogue, which is a public institution in Israel. Can you imagine if something like that happened in the US? How our community would react? Would this happen in Israel? So I want to hear the Jewish community rage about that as well. How come we fight here for every poster of hostages that is being torn away from poles in New York, but it is done regularly in Israel by Jews? Mm-hmm. So I want to hear the Jewish community. I want them to be aware of that. Maybe they're not aware of that. I want them to be aware of that, and I want to see their rage.
Mm-hmm. Well, Vered, I think that you're part of the solution here. I mean, you are speaking about this. You talked about people getting out of their comfort zones. I can only imagine this wasn't what you thought you'd be doing, for the past year, and not to, I mean, like you said, there's always going to be someone who's putting themselves more at risk. But I guess I do want to first applaud you for what you're doing, and just what you just said, I think is maybe news to some of our viewers.
Right.
And so I think you should keep doing what you're doing. However, I do want to ask you, are you getting the support you need? Are you I can only imagine you've been affected personally, professionally. I mean, I think you'd mentioned that you don't find as much joy in cooking or music or this or that. So tell us a little bit just about your coping.
First of all, thank you so much for what you're saying. It's very important to me. It's a difficult year. I don't know what to say. I'm not the only one, but all my family is in Israel. It's very difficult to talk to my parents, who just a few days ago they live in Tel Aviv, so they're safe. Relatively speaking, they are in their 80s and had to run to the shelter in like very early, almost middle of the night this week for a missile that was shot from Iraq. It's very difficult. It's very heartbreaking to hear my own family who was not affected, personally, and how heartbroken they are of what's happening to the country that we love. Yeah, it's true. I did not listen to music for this all year. I can't. But then, actually, just this week, in a car ride, my son put Elvis Costello's CD that we love. It's called the River in Reverse. It's a CD that he made with Alain Toussaint after Hurricane Katrina. And there's one song that's called A River in Reverse that I just, it made me sad, but I just related so much to it. It says something like, wake me up with I will not sing, but I'll say, wake me up with a slap or a kiss. There must be something better than this, because I can see how this can get much worse. How do we send the river in reverse? So yeah, it felt very close to how I feel. My kids told me at one point this year, like, we are so ready to talk about something else, but I'm not ready. I'm just not ready. I understand their misery with this. I can't think of anything else, unfortunately. And I'm not alone. Like, so many of my friends, definitely the organizers of Unacceptable DC, are all here, and so many of the Israeli American community. It's hard to continue with our lives as long as there are still hostages there. And I know that all of Israel feels like me. I can only imagine, I cannot even imagine what the families are going through. You cannot continue with your life as long as people are suffering there.
Of course, October 7th is just around the corner, and it's on a Monday. And so I wanted to ask, what your plans were for that day, and then maybe just on a final note, for those watching who are either inspired or enraged, or any range of emotions, hearing from you, what can they do to help you in your cause?
Thank you. Then thanks for asking this. So on October 7th, specifically us, we're going to do an event that will be more like a community gathering, talking circles, at Temple Adat Shalom in Potomac, Maryland. We can send the details. We want to think together with our community of what to do next. Just the questions you asked me, like, how do we continue? What's the best effort we can do as a community to help solve this nightmare? We are working now on initiative to have the community sign on letters asking from the government to sign a deal, and from the leaders of the Jewish community in the United States to issue such statement as well. So, if anybody wants to contact me, I'm happy to share the information. We just started this, as we're always trying to think of what to do next, how to help in any way we can. It's been very frustrating, because the truth is, it's only since the release of the hostages through a deal that happened thanks to Biden in November, we were still waiting and hoping for another deal, and nothing changed so far. So I'm happy to answer, and people can contact me directly or through Moment Magazine, and we'll just give you updates and information about anything that we do.
Well, Vered, thank you so much for this conversation, and for all your work, and Take care. Take care of yourself.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.